Hello everyone, isn't it interesting how despite all of its unique and wacky mechanics, Mario Kart World didn't bring back anti-gravity from Mario Kart 8 Deluxe? Sure, some tracks feature sections that evoke the way these parts were designed, and technically the second half of Rainbow Road does have a subtle form of anti-grav, but even though there are indicators in World's concept art that this may have been planned at one point, there's nothing in the finished game that looks or functions exactly like the central gimmick of its predecessor. Now, back when Mario Kart World was first revealed, I remember the apparent lack of this feature not feeling like that big of a deal to me. The prevalent idea at the time that anti-gravity was a relatively shallow gameplay mechanic in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and the fact that the booster course pass didn't feature a single track that truly relied on the gimmick, made it easy to accept that World wouldn't feature this kind of gameplay whatsoever. But with the benefit of hindsight, and also looking towards the future and the potential of Mario Kart 8 tracks being brought back as retros, this whole situation is a bit strange, right? Well, that's why I want to make sense of it. Today I'm gonna speculate about why Mario Kart World didn't bring back anti-gravity, and whether there's a chance it'll still end up doing so down the line. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get started. One potential reason I think for why anti-gravity was omitted from Mario Kart World is that Nintendo wasn't that satisfied with the way the gimmick's implementation in 8 Deluxe turned out. Like I alluded to earlier, these days it seems like the idea that anti-gravity didn't really add that much to the gameplay of Mario Kart 8 has become quite popular, and I definitely agree with that to an extent. I remember when the game was being marketed with the gimmick front and center, it felt like a really big deal. But apart from the slightly different physics and bumper boost mechanic, which seem kinda arbitrary, these sections don't actually play that differently. And in a broader sense, the introduction of anti-gravity led to a bunch of strange, twisty, turny track designs that look dazzling but are arguably less interesting to play on than normal track segments. Whereas grounded track designs tend to incorporate a wide array of dynamic obstacles or gameplay gimmicks, not to mention shortcuts, these roller coaster-like segments are actually kinda simplistic most of the time. Maybe because the idea was that the anti-gravity visuals alone would make them interesting by default. Of course, there are also plenty of these types of sections that do feature unique ideas on top of the anti-gravity twist, but even most of these could have technically worked just as well without the gimmick. Racing up a waterfall is inherently cool and facilitates some interesting gameplay mechanics, but this could have played exactly the same as a straightforward river section. And for every track segment like this that is naturally incorporated into the environmental design of an area, there are loads of anti-gravity sections that aren't really contextualized whatsoever. What is this part of Sunshine Airport supposed to be? Or these turns on Sweet Sweet Canyon? Or this segment of Ice Ice Outpost? The list goes on and on. The way Mario Kart 8 manages to make most of its tracks feel like living, breathing environments, like no other Mario Kart game before it, makes these inexplicable anti-gravity parts all the more baffling. For example, just think about how much more interesting a nightclub track like Electrodrome could have been had it actually bothered to incorporate this theming into its track design, instead of it being yet another road tangle track that, as far as gameplay goes, is basically interchangeable with several others. And so to tie this criticism back into the video's central question, maybe Nintendo's designers somewhat agree with these gripes, which contributed to the decision to drop the mechanic. Considering the booster course pass basically proved that players will eat up new Mario Kart content, no matter if it features these kinds of sections or not, perhaps the designers realized that the inherent cool factor of driving upside down simply wasn't worth the compromised track design, and also actually was never that much of a draw for fans. So Mario Kart World was used as an opportunity to purposefully get away from 8 Deluxe's knotted shoelace track style and return to a more traditional type of design. But the thing is, that clearly isn't what happened. Even though World doesn't feature conventional anti-gravity, it still undoubtedly continues in the footsteps of the track design style of Mario Kart 8. Tracks like Mario Bros. Circuit, Starview Peak, DK Spaceport, Peach Stadium, Dry Bones Burnout, and of course Rainbow Road all feel very much in line with the roller coaster track design style we just talked about. That's not to say these tracks are poorly designed. DK Spaceport and Dry Bones Burnout are two of my favorites, but add some blue decals along the sides of the roads and ignore the grind rails and they'd be right at home in Mario Kart 8. So no, I don't think the Mario Kart designers had a change of heart regarding the way 8 Deluxe evolved the franchise's track design style, since Mario Kart World's tracks fit right in line with that evolution. Another reason for Mario Kart World's lack of anti-gravity might be that the mechanic couldn't have possibly worked side by side with the game's other gimmicks and systems. For example, here's a question. Imagine this section of Mario Kart 8's Mario Circuit was a part of World's free roam, and you fell off. What would happen? The gravity here is upside down, so the player would fall into the sky. That's not a problem in Mario Kart 8 because this stuff is out of bounds, so the player gets warped back, but free roam isn't supposed to work like that. With a few exceptions, all of the game's tracks are designed to be explorable and thus allow you to jump off the side of the road at any given moment. But the Mario Kart 8 style of anti-gravity tunnels only really work when they're surrounded by out-of-bounds tunnels, because this allowed the developers to avoid having to deal with a complicated Super Mario Galaxy-like system of overlapping gravity fields. And so it's probably not a coincidence that the only Mario Kart World track that does feature anti-gravity is also the one part of the game that isn't explorable in free roam. Now, I'm not saying this is an insurmountable issue. If Nintendo's designers had really wanted to make some Mario Kart World tracks with anti-gravity, I doubt a logistical problem like this would have stopped them. They could have just surrounded these sections with out-of-bounds regions and called it a day, or found some other more creative solution. But in the same way that Mario Kart World's many new gimmicks and systems likely at least influenced the choice to not bring back underwater gameplay, I'm sure this stuff was also a contributing factor in regards to the decision to mostly avoid anti-gravity sections. But when it comes to new Mario Kart World mechanics likely contributing to the removal of anti-gravity, of course the main suspect should be wall riding. The fact that Mario Kart World allows players to drive on basically any surface that's perpendicular to the road for a brief period of time is still kinda crazy to me. Like, sure, doing this isn't actually a very efficient way to traverse most track segments, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the designers implemented this gimmick in basically the least restrictive way possible. And because of that, I find it hard to imagine how wall riding and Mario Kart 8 style anti-gravity could possibly coexist. This isn't necessarily a logistics problem. Technically, having two different systems for doing basically the same thing in one game side by side is entirely possible, but from a game design and intuitiveness standpoint, this wouldn't make sense whatsoever. And I think that's partially because it's fair to assume that wall riding isn't some random new gimmick the Mario Kart World devs came up with that happens to overlap with the design of some anti-gravity sections. No, obviously this is the evolution of that same idea. The few sections in Mario Kart 8 where players can ride on the wall perpendicular to the normal road represent just about the only transformative use of anti-gravity in the entire game. So the designers took 8's handful of cool but inefficient wall riding segments and managed to turn them into a gimmick that fits perfectly with Mario Kart World's ethos of player freedom and expression. Anti-gravity wasn't removed from Mario Kart World because wall riding was introduced, it's more likely the other way around. Anti-gravity didn't make the cut, but wall riding was introduced as a way of salvaging and expanding upon the gimmick's most interesting application. Okay, so enough faffing about then. What did actually cause the removal of anti-gravity? Well, this might sound a bit vague, but I think it probably comes down to the gimmick's incompatibility with Mario Kart World's design on a thematic level. Most in-house Nintendo titles aren't directly built off of the previous entry in each game's respective franchise. They're designed from the ground up to revolve around a handful of new and innovative ideas, and all of the surrounding elements, including stuff brought over from previous games, are secondary concerns. Mario Kart World's core design principle that formed the backbone for the game's development is the player's freedom to traverse tracks in any way they like and explore an interconnected world. This conceit is supported by most of the game's new ideas, like the ability to drive on the walls or water, and also mechanics brought back from previous games like glider sections. Even the decision to double the driver count works in tandem with the free-form split path design of both the interconnected open world segments and individual tracks. But the inherently restrictive nature of anti-gravity sections goes against this principle of player freedom. And whereas some designers might take that incompatibility as a challenge to find a compromise, the laser focus of Nintendo's designers on each game's central principle makes it to where they're unafraid to scrap an idea if it doesn't quite fit. I assume for the most part the game's designers were satisfied with the way anti-gravity was implemented into Mario Kart 8, but they also wanted to give Mario Kart World its own track design style that fits with its overall identity. And although, like I've already pointed out, in many ways World's tracks follow in the footsteps of 8, the fact that this continuity was achieved without actually having to implement explicit anti-gravity goes to show that the gimmick was always kinda gimmicky and not actually a design necessity. It's like how Mario Kart World also brings back quarter pipes from Mario Kart Wii and 8 Deluxe, but not in a way that draws attention to itself. The game isn't being marketed around these mechanics, they're not selling points, and they also don't specifically jive with its design philosophy, so there's no need to make them stand out anymore. Mario Kart World doesn't feature traditional anti-gravity because it doesn't have to. But what if it did have to? The part of this debate that I haven't delved into yet doesn't revolve around why anti-gravity wasn't added to Mario Kart World, but whether it still might be in the future. Assuming the game ends up getting DLC that adds new retro tracks, will Mario Kart 8's track roster continue to be ignored? Unless you're delusional and consider Sky High Sunday to be an 8 Deluxe track, Mario Kart World is the first Mario Kart game since the introduction of standardized retro tracks that doesn't bring back a single track from the previous entry in the franchise. And that does seem very deliberate. Before World, there was actually a clear pattern of the previous Mario Kart game being among the titles with the most amount of representation in the retro track roster of the next game. Mario Kart DS featured 4 tracks taken from each of the preceding 4 games, then there were 4 DS tracks in Wii, 4 Wii tracks in 7, and 4 Mario Kart 7 tracks in 8, so long as we count the original DLC cups. But the game with the most amount of representation in Mario Kart World is DS for some reason, with only 3 tracks. Now, it could be that there's a simple explanation for this, which is that the developers didn't want to add anti-gravity to the game, and thus most Mario Kart 8 tracks were off the table by default. But another explanation for this omission could be that the developers figured a lot of us have gotten pretty bored of Mario Kart 8's track roster after all these years. It would have been kinda unexciting to have 1/8 of Mario Kart World be comprised of tracks that we've been playing for over a decade, especially since they likely wouldn't have featured significantly upgraded visuals or anything. Though I suppose the fact that the game did bring back Moo Moo Meadows again goes to show that this line of thinking maybe wasn't a priority for the developers. So, for the purposes of the remainder of this video, let's assume Mario Kart 8 tracks end up being added to the game as DLC. How would that work? Could these tracks function without anti-gravity? Out of Mario Kart 8's 25 Nitro tracks, only 3 don't feature the gimmick whatsoever, so these could be brought over to World basically unchanged. I kinda don't think crossover tracks like Excitebike Arena and Animal Crossing will actually ever be brought back, but Super Bell Subway would fit in very well with Mario Kart World's existing railway system and interconnected world. However, there are of course also plenty of 8 original tracks that technically feature anti-gravity, but not in a way that is essential to the overall design. The wall-riding anti-gravity sections in Thwomp Ruins, Toad Harbor, and Bone Dry Dunes could just about be replicated through World's version of the gimmick, and there are also 4 other tracks that only feature anti-gravity in sections that are less slanted than parts of Mario Kart World's tracks. The only track that features wall driving that I don't think could be brought back mostly unchanged is Mount Wario, since a section this long wouldn't work with the way World's wall riding gimmick is implemented, and in general performing this trick is normally never mandatory to progress through a track. Though there are other edge case tracks that contain parts that are probably too slanted to work without anti-gravity in their current state, which I think could work perfectly fine with a few adjustments. Peach Stadium was clearly directly inspired by Mario Kart Stadium, and so that track's sloped turns could be made slightly more gentle and play just like these ones. The same also goes for these turns on Ice Ice Outpost, the Thundercloud part of Cloudtop Cruise, and maybe even the second half of Rainbow Road. Though what I doubt the developers would ever do is drastically change the angle of anti-gravity sections that are contextualized within the environment. Even though towards the beginning of this video I pointed out that the waterfall section of Shy Guy Falls would also work as a river section, that doesn't mean I think the developers would actually ever make that change. It wouldn't be worth the hassle just to end up with a compromised version of the track. And speaking of compromises, why would the developers bother with any of these changes? If they want to implement Mario Kart 8 tracks down the line, why not just bring back anti-gravity after all? I think the number one thing that suggests that this is a genuine possibility is the way quarter pipes were handled in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Just like Mario Kart 7 before it, 8 originally didn't bring back quarter pipes from Mario Kart Wii, which meant the gimmick had to be removed from the game's iteration of Wario's Goldmine. But then, I guess because of its onslaught of Mario Kart Wii retros, the Booster Course Pass brought a slightly tweaked version of the quarter pipe mechanic back after all. The fact that therefore Mario Kart 8 Deluxe features a retro track that omitted the gimmick side by side with several that didn't is far from the least inconsistent thing about the DLC, but I have always found this kinda funny. And this dichotomy actually works as an argument in favor of the idea that anti-gravity still has a chance of being implemented into Mario Kart World. A weird thing about the fact that the game already features sections that are clearly anti-gravity inspired is that these would kinda clash with actual anti-gravity sections should those be added down the line. But considering the strangeness of 8 Deluxe's quarter pipe inconsistency wasn't a deal breaker for the developers, this likely wouldn't be either. Though if we look beyond the broad strokes of these two cases, the comparison kinda falls apart. The quarter pipe gimmick likely didn't take that much work to implement, especially given the developers reused anti-gravity related assets and animations for it for some reason. But it's hard to overstate just how much effort would have to go into adding Mario Kart 8 style anti-gravity to a game that wasn't made for it. I'm not talking about the programming of the actual gimmick, but the visuals. Mario Kart World features 40 karts that, unlike in the previous few games, each have bespoke wheels, some of which clearly weren't designed for an anti-gravity style rotation animation. So although it would fit nicely with the way they transform to fit other types of environments, I doubt the developers are gonna rework the game's kart animation system just for the DLC. We also shouldn't forget about what was likely the root cause of the Quarter Pipe edition. The reason the Booster Course Pass had to haphazardly implement the gimmick doesn't come down to a game design decision on the part of its developers, I think. It's probably just a result of the fact that the DLC's track models were ported directly from Mario Kart Tour, which already had quarter pipes, and so it was easier to port them over than to rework all of these segments. But as far as Mario Kart World goes, currently, even though it's already been a year, I think it's fair to assume that its eventual DLC won't be as much of a slapdash afterthought as the Booster Course Pass. And so I doubt it'll exhibit these same kind of design compromises. If the possibility of the game eventually featuring proper anti-gravity as a part of future DLC was ever on the table during the development of its original content, I don't think some of its tracks would feature fake anti-grav sections, or that Rainbow Road would technically use the gimmick, but in a way that avoids all of its associated quirks and visuals. So, although I would love to be proven wrong, no, I don't think Mario Kart World will end up featuring anti-gravity, even as a part of DLC. Overall, in terms of its implementation of tried and tested gimmicks, Mario Kart World feels like a turning point in the franchise. Going from Mario Kart DS to 8 Deluxe, it's easy to follow the mostly linear introduction and evolution of ideas and mechanics. Ignoring a few of Mario Kart Wii's secondary gimmicks, each game directly built on top of the last without removing anything super significant. But I think it's fair to say that this growing pool of mechanics was a ticking time bomb all along. Given the Mario Kart franchise is known for its approachability, this was never gonna keep going forever. Some gimmicks were always gonna have to be trimmed eventually. And this isn't the first time a former main mechanic has been dropped from a Mario Kart sequel. I mean, Double Dash's selling point was never brought back either. The only thing that makes the removal of anti-gravity more questionable is that it is a fundamental part of most of Mario Kart 8's tracks, and I doubt those will continue to be ignored in future games. Whether it ends up being as a part of Mario Kart World DLC or a sequel to the game, it'll be fascinating to see how the developers get around this conundrum down the line. And of course, as I've talked about at length in a previous video, anti-gravity isn't the only Mario Kart gimmick that's currently stuck in limbo. So unless future Mario Kart games drop the retro track concept entirely, which actually I do think is somewhat feasible, I wouldn't say there's any reason for them to specifically follow World's lead in cutting themselves off from like half of the franchise's modern tracks. Moving forward, there's a chance Mario Kart World ends up becoming the black sheep of the series, the one game that seemed to purposefully diverge from the trajectory of the previous entries. And for what it's worth, I think that's kind of cool. The whole reason Nintendo games continue to be successful is because they're often not iterative. They feature bold one-off ideas that no one could have seen coming. Mario Kart World is a controversial game for many reasons, but the lack of underwater and upside-down driving aren't among them. And to reiterate this point one more time, that's probably exactly why the mechanics were removed. Mario Kart World didn't need anti-gravity, so Mario Kart World doesn't have anti-gravity. And that's all I wanted to talk about. If you've got anything to add as far as possible answers to this video's central questions goes, be sure to do so by leaving a comment. While you're down there, maybe also consider leaving a like or subscribing. I also have a public Discord server linked in the description, and if you want to support the channel and get early access to my videos, maybe consider signing up for a membership. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!